He thought he was just helping an elderly woman struggling with groceries. What he didn't know, she was a millionaire, and what she did next would change his life forever. Daniel Carter's hands were rough from years of hard labor, his flannel jacket worn at the elbows. The cold wind cut through the thin fabric as he walked into the grocery store, his 6-year-old daughter, Lily, skipping beside him, unaware of the weight pressing on his shoulders. Money was tight. Too tight. The past year had been brutal. After losing his construction job, he had taken on whatever work he could find, but it was never enough. Every grocery trip felt like a battle, carefully choosing what they could afford, always putting Lily's needs before his own. As they moved through the aisles, Daniel noticed an elderly woman standing by the shelves, staring at a can of soup with a troubled expression. Her small, frail frame was wrapped in an old coat, and her silver hair was neatly combed, but there was a sadness in her eyes. Lily tugged at his sleeve. "Daddy," she looked sad. Daniel nodded, stepping forward. "Mom, are you okay?" The woman looked up, startled. "Oh, I'm fine, dear. Just trying to decide what to get." He noticed her cart, barely anything inside. A small loaf of bread, a jar of peanut butter and some tea bags. Daniel hesitated. He barely had enough for his own groceries, but something about the woman's tired eyes made him push aside his own struggles. "Why don't you take both?" he said gently. "The chicken noodle and the tomato soup." She gave a small, sad smile. "I wish I could, but money's a bit tight these days." Without thinking, Daniel grabbed both cans and placed them in her cart. Her eyes widened. "Oh no, dear, I couldn't." "It's okay," Daniel interrupted. "I know what it's like to struggle." She studied him for a long moment, her gaze soft. She studied him for a long moment, her gaze soft yet unreadable. Daniel expected her to protest, but instead she gave a small nod, her wrinkled hand resting lightly on the cans. "Thank you," she murmured, almost as if she wasn't used to kindness. Lily, sensing the moment, grinned up at her. "Daddy says helping people makes your heart happy." The woman chuckled, a genuine smile tugging at her lips. "Your daddy is a wise man." Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. Wise? He didn't feel wise. He felt like a failure, barely scraping by, unable to give his daughter the life she deserved. But he smiled anyway. They walked to the checkout together, and as Daniel placed his small selection of groceries on the counter, he carefully counted his bills, making sure he had just enough. He didn't notice the elderly woman watching him closely. As they stepped outside, the cold air biting at his face, Daniel turned to say goodbye. But she wasn't looking at him. She was staring at Lily, an expression of deep sorrow in her eyes. "Your little girl reminds me of someone," she said softly. "My granddaughter. I lost her a long time ago." Daniel hesitated. "I'm sorry," he said, not knowing what else to say. There was something in the woman's voice, a deep sadness, as if she were carrying years of regret. She looked at Lily again, her eyes misty. She had the same smile, the same light in her eyes. Lily tilted her head. "Did she like soup too?" The woman chuckled, wiping at her eyes. "Oh, she loved it, especially chicken noodle." Daniel could feel the weight of the moment, but before he could respond, the woman reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small, elegant card. She hesitated for a moment before handing it to him. "If you ever need anything, call this number." Daniel glanced down at the card, expecting an ordinary name and number, but his breath caught in his throat. Margaret Whitmore. The name sounded familiar, too familiar. It took him a second to connect the dots. The Whitmore family was one of the wealthiest in the state, a legacy of old money, real estate, and businesses spanning generations. His eyes darted back to her, his mind racing. "You're that Margaret Whitmore?" he asked in disbelief. She smiled, but there was a sadness behind it. "I suppose I am." Daniel was stunned. He had spent the past 10 years barely making ends meet, struggling to put food on the table. And here stood a woman who could probably buy the entire grocery store without blinking. And yet, she had been standing there, deciding between 2 cans of soup, just like him. "Why were you—" he started, but she gently shook her head. "Money doesn't fix everything, dear. Sometimes life takes things from you that no amount of wealth can replace." Daniel didn't know what to say. She smiled again and squeezed his hand. "Call me, Daniel. Not just when you need something, just call." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, his mind spinning. Lily tugged at his sleeve. "Daddy, is she a fairy godmother?" Daniel let out a soft laugh, shaking his head. "I don't know, sweetheart. But maybe she's something close." What he didn't know was that this moment, this small act of kindness, was about to change his life forever. The next morning, Daniel was still thinking about Margaret Whitmore. He had tucked her card into his wallet, unsure if he would ever use it. Rich people didn't just give out their numbers to struggling single dads. Maybe she had been caught up in the moment, just being polite. Still, something about her lingered in his mind. As he walked Lily to school, he noticed the way she skipped ahead, her little backpack bouncing with each step. Her bright energy was the only thing that kept him going on the hardest days. "Daddy, do you think we'll ever have a big house like the ones in the nice neighborhoods?" she asked suddenly, glancing up at him. Daniel sighed. "I don't know, sweetheart, but I promise we'll always have a home." Lily smiled, satisfied with his answer, and ran ahead to join her friends. Later that afternoon, Daniel was back at the grocery store, picking up the cheapest bread and milk he could find. His paycheck from the warehouse job barely covered rent, and with bills piling up, every dollar counted. As he reached for a loaf of bread, a familiar voice stopped him. "Daniel." He turned and saw Margaret Whitmore standing there, but this time she wasn't in a worn-out coat. She was dressed in an elegant navy suit, her posture straight, exuding quiet confidence. Daniel felt suddenly self-conscious in his faded jeans and worn-out sneakers. "I was hoping I'd see you again," she said warmly. Daniel managed a smile. "Yeah? Well, here I am. Same grocery store, same struggle." Margaret studied him for a moment before nodding toward the cafe section at the front of the store. "Would you mind sitting with me for a bit? I have something I'd like to discuss." Daniel hesitated. He had a long list of things to do, job applications to send, an extra shift to pick up if he could, but something in her tone made him nod. "All right," he said, following her to a small table near the window. Margaret sat across from him, folding her hands neatly. "I wasn't completely honest with you yesterday," she admitted. Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" she sighed. "My husband and I built one of the largest charitable foundations in the country. We've helped fund hospitals, schools, shelters, but after he passed away, I realized I had lost touch with what really mattered. I spent so many years writing checks, but I forgot what it felt like to truly help someone up close." Daniel listened carefully, unsure where this was going. "I've been looking for someone," she continued. "Someone who understands struggle, who knows what it's like to fight for something real. Not just another businessman who only cares about profits." She reached into her purse and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table. Daniel hesitated before opening it. His breath caught. Inside were documents outlining a new project, an outreach program designed to help struggling families find stable housing, jobs, and support. At the bottom of the page was a name listed as Project Director. His name. His hands tightened around the papers. "Margaret, this has to be a mistake." She shook her head. "It's not. You helped me when you didn't have to. And more than that, I saw something in you, Daniel. Strength, kindness. You're exactly the kind of person I need to help me run this." His mind reeled. A salary more than 3 times what he made now. Benefits, stability. A real future for him and Lily. He swallowed hard, staring at the offer in front of him. "But why me?" he finally whispered. Margaret smiled. "Because sometimes the people who have struggled the most are the ones who know exactly how to change the world." Tears burned at the back of Daniel's eyes as he looked at her, and at that moment he knew his life was about to change forever.